series called Weird Religion. Weird Religion, what made the first Christians weird and why we should be weird today. And I want to start with a really famous colloquialism. Have you all heard of the phrase, there's nothing sacred anymore? There's nothing sacred anymore. And you guys probably, how many of you used that in your life? There's nothing sacred anymore. Okay, boomers, come on, this is your time. All right? There's nothing sacred anymore. I once had a friend who he used that line when the new Star Wars franchise rebooted. He's like, man, there's nothing sacred anymore. I felt that. That's how I think I felt I was getting older when they started making new Star Warses. I remember another friend once, they started selling individual grandma's cookies. I don't know if you guys, this might be a Utah thing, but there were these grandma's cookies, and they started kind of taking something that was very special to us and then packaging them in like dozens for $5. And I can remember my friend saying, there's nothing sacred anymore. You're packaging grandma's cookies for $5. And how many of us have sacred cows, right? How many, not like the literal sacred cow that you're worshiping, okay? But like something that is so important to us that if it was taken away or if it was changed, we would be so upset. Maybe we have a favorite restaurant that, is there and not there anymore. Maybe, and this Pullman might be too soon for stuff like that. But I think we all have these like sacred cow. I know in seminary we used to talk about theology, like what's your sacred cow theology? What's that thing that if it was to not be true, you would just crumble, right? So we all have these kind of sacred, or how we use these colloquialisms as sacred in our lives. And it's a kind of a standard slang that laments something important to us, or maybe it's lost important and deep meaning. And it's one of those words that we use all the time, sacred, sacred. And it goes back to our Roman forebears, to a time way before our cultural context today. And the Latin word for sacred is sacrum, sacrum. And it just means, it's a very important religious word in the Greco-Roman world, but it just means consecrated. We might even use the word holy is probably more our religiosity or our Christianese way of saying it, holy or sacred. But it's an extremely important word to the Greco-Roman world, and it was extremely important to the context of what Paul, the New Testament, even the Lord himself is speaking into when it comes to Gentile believers coming to follow Jesus. And this is really what we're talking about this whole series is how weird these early Christians were in these contexts. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the temples and the church, because there was not a more sacred place to a Greco-Roman than temples. There was not a more sacred place in their mind. So let's talk about temples in ancient Rome for a minute here, because we got to set the base for how weird these first Christians were going to be. So temples were very much at the core of every part of Greco-Roman society, especially in the first century with the birth of the Jesus movement. They really served two core functions. They served a religious function and a civil function. Religious and a civil function. One of my favorite classicists, her name is Dr. Mary Beard. She says this: temples gave Romans a way to display their piety, their wealth, and their power, often all at once. Temples gave them the ability to display their piety, their wealth, and their power, often all at once. And if you've ever been to the ancient Mediterranean, you know that some of the largest, most imposing architectures of the ancient Roman Empire are the temples. They're magnificent. They're huge structures that you would just are hard to even fathom how they built and established these things. And they were meant to inspire awe. They were meant to inspire the grandeur of a particular city or a statesman, whoever is creating those types of buildings. But they also were very sacred. And from a religious function, the ancient historian Greg Wolfe said, temples were the principal points of contact between human and divine in Roman cities. Staging points between earth and heaven. So they were these kind of, in the Greco-Roman mindset, as well as just ancient mindset, they were these kind of portals that at those locations, as they were consecrated and made sacred, they then became this place where heaven and earth kind of intersect. And this is not only just true of the Greeks and the Romans, this goes back all the way to the ancient Near East, and who knows where all of this begins. In fact, the Bible has a lot of language that talks about the temple being this cross-section between heaven and earth. This is no different to how the Greeks and the Romans are thinking about it. In the ancient mind, divinity truly needed a place to dwell among the common people. A few weeks ago we talked about idols and how idols were these embodiments of the divine. Well, temples were the house for the idol, for the embodiment. So not only were they a place of the overlapping space between heaven and earth, but they were also the place that housed the idol or the god. And so the Romans would call these things domuses, which is Latin for house. These are temples, are houses for the idols. They shield the idol from the elements. They had a place for the idol to kind of lay its head in a way, right? It needed a home to live in, right? This is kind of the way the ancient mindset is thinking, as well as places to collect the tributes, the treasures, everything that the idol would need to be important or sacred. And that was kind of the base understanding of what religious temples were functioning as: a home for the idols, a place where human and divine intersect. So if you were to enter into the intersanctum of the temple, therefore you would be in this kind of mixed area of divine and earth. So they were very sacred and held to high admiration and respect. You didn't want to become sacrilegious. You didn't want to do the things that would upset the gods if you were to disrespect those particular places. And capital punishments were dealt out in the ancient world for disrespecting sacred sites like temples. And some of my favorite stories are more in the Greek side of the space of the Mediterranean, where you would have fugitives often run to inside of temples in order to have some kind of a refuge, because it was illegal to kill somebody or to harm somebody if they were seeking asylum within the actual domus or the temple. I think this will actually become adopted a little bit later in the kind of medieval ages, where it talked about sanctuary, churches taking in people as sanctuary. This is a kind of a form of that adoption that we've taken even into our societies. But it was considered a huge sacrilege to do something, to hurt somebody as they took refuge within a domus or a temple. You were to honor the temples. You were to honor the gods. You were to honor the idols that live within these temples, to shower them with treasures and tribute and things like this in order to show their importance. These were really important when it comes to societal stability, avoiding disasters like plagues or military defeats, like we talked about with rituals the first week of this series. All of these kind of play into an importance of the way that the people of that time are thinking about how we need to understand temples. And they would have thought to love the gods, one was to care for the idol within the temple and worship them at the temples. And if you really wanted to show your piety, you would build more temples, which is why historically you see a lot of great Romans and Roman generals creating lots of temples, building temples, showing their power, wealth, and piety. The more grand the temple, the more devotion and piety of that particular individual. So this is the context, again, that which the early church is coming into. They also served a civil function. So temples served as a symbol of the state's authority and public identity. In fact, if you go to ancient Athens today, the first thing you'll probably see is the Parthenon. This is a really famous temple in ancient Athens. It's huge. This picture does not give it the credit it deserves. Who's ever been there? You guys ever been to Athens and the Parthenon? Yeah, it is probably one of the most famous temples. And it was built not only for a place of religious function, but to show the greatness of Athenian power. You were supposed to go into Athens and then be awed by this powerful state, this place of great wealth and power. And these were imposing forces in the ancient world. And you were, again, meant to think, boy, this equals greatness. Bigger is better, right? The more grander the temple, the more we love our gods and the greater our city is. And often, many times, seats of governments would meet within temples, discuss state business within temples, all under the watchful eyes of that particular god. And it also was very much a part of like a bank. A lot of temples often served as banks with state funds and treasuries. We have a lot of examples of the ancient world of temples being raided and obviously pillaged and looted because of the great wealth that was contained in there. They held judicial hearings. Again, you just think about the entire ancient structure of life, bureaucracy, governance, all being centered around temples in the ancient world. They were the most important buildings in any ancient city. A place for the gods to dwell, to ensure prosperity of the city, a place literally where they thought heaven and earth intersect, a place to reinforce the power structures and the place to be obeyed and respected. And again, in this world, in this context, came Jesus and the first Christians. And it was in the life and teachings of Jesus that would begin to turn this idea of sacred temples on its head. And it made the Christians very dangerous, very weird, in a lot of different ways. So here comes our Lord Jesus, and tells of a time where there will be no physical temples. And one of my favorite examples of this is in John chapter 4, when he's having the conversation on that hot day with the Samaritan woman, the woman from Samaria, a place just north of Jerusalem. Perhaps you're familiar with the story, but the Samaritans and Jews did not get along. They were rivals, but they mostly fought over where was the temple built. That was kind of the big friction within the Samaritans and the Jews at the time of Jesus. And the Jews worshiped God on the temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans worshiped God on the temple of Mount Gerizim, and so there was conflict. You're worshiping God in the wrong place is how they would often discuss these things. And in fact, this woman pushes Jesus and has a physical debate with him at the well on this hot day. And here's the tail end of their conversation in John 4. The Samaritan woman says, "Our ancestors worshiped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place we must worship is in Jerusalem." And in verse 21, Jesus says, "Woman," this was not a derogatory term, Jesus replied, "Believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshiper the Father seeks." Now get what Jesus is saying here. You know, they're talking, this woman's like, where do we worship God? You worship in Jerusalem, we worship here at Mount Gerizim. And Jesus is saying it's going to be neither. Neither place will be the fulfillment of where the temple will be seen. In fact, we see the worship of the Father in the Spirit and in truth. Jesus is pointing to a reality where God will not dwell in temples made by human hands, really a fruition of a lot of what the Old Testament speaks of as well. Not on mountains, not in fancy buildings up on a hill within the cities, but in the Spirit and in truth. This is one of the central themes of the Gospel of John. Because in the very beginning of the Gospel of John, in John 1:14, it says, "The Word," speaking of Jesus, Word became flesh. God became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So John is even capturing this first line in his introduction to the book, that where Jesus walked and where he lived, it was the living tabernacle. It was the dwelling place. It was the very temple of God everywhere he went. And so John is talking to a group of people. This is post 70 AD, which if you know your history, what happened in 70 AD? Do you guys know? Follow Jerusalem, the temple is destroyed. And so John is talking to a group of people in past 70 AD, and if you're a Jewish person, you're going, what in the world is going on? Where are we supposed to know and worship God? How are we supposed to know him without this dwelling place, this temple? Right? And John is reassuring them that this was always part of the plan, that Jesus was the embodiment, he was the temple here on earth. And that there is another temple that is also here, that is not on a mountain, that is not in a place, but is in a particular different dynamic that I'm going to share with you. Don't want to give it away yet. Spoiler alert. The idea of the divine dwelling being outside a physical location, though, or place such as a temple, was an absolute scandal. It was a scandal to the ancient Jewish people of Jesus' day. It was a scandal to the Greco-Romans of their day. It's backwards and it's weird. People would have asked, and they would have asked very strange questions that we would have thought of today, that we probably wouldn't have thought of today, but things that would have been upsetting to the religious society and civil society. Things like, where would your priest sacrifice and perform ritual? If you don't have a temple, where do your priests sacrifice and perform ritual? How could the state show its divine power and favor? You could imagine kind of the wealthier elements of society and being like, well, how do I show off my power and my wealth if it's not within temples for people to admire? They would have wondered these things. Where would your people go to meet their God? What do you mean? Your God doesn't have a domus? It doesn't have a place? It doesn't have a dwelling place on earth? It became something to use to actually attack the first Christians. We have some examples of this by a guy named Celsus, writing he's about 77 years after the first century. But he's a Greek philosopher and he's mocking Christian worship, and this is what he has to say. He says, the temples in which these Christians assemble are not comparable to those that are well known to all, and those who have no place, but make their assembly in private houses scandalous. It looks to me like so many atheists. Nor do we even keep festivals in common with them, nor have we any community of temples or altars. Nor do we sacrifice together, nor are there any shrines which are common to all in which we sacrifice and worship. And so this Greek philosopher is going, look, these first Christians, and going, these guys are atheists, which I don't bet you weren't expecting that today. These are atheists. The first Christians were seen as godless. That's what that word means, godless. They were godless. They didn't have temples. They didn't have altars. They met in private housing at night. How scandalous and mischievous they would have thought about these first Christians. To the regular Roman, these were godless people without any kind of piety, wealth, or power. What Jesus was teaching and reinforced all throughout the Torah. If we understand the Old Testament, we understand that God never designed his presence to be contained within a building made by hands of man. But it was always pointing to something far greater, the life of Jesus and the people of Jesus. What the faithful in the Bible recognize early, what Jesus instructed and what the new church was living out, was that God desires to dwell in people rather than in places. God desired to dwell in people rather than in places. This is so important if we're going to understand kind of New Testament temple theology. Paul knew this and had to remind mainly Romanized Corinthians when he is kind of, in a way, scolding them about what it means to be a temple. 1 Corinthians 3:16 through 17 is kind of our main text today. This is what he writes to these Corinthians. He says, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. Paul does not mix words, does he? He is correcting the Corinthians around something about their identity. He says, you yourselves, this is the y'all of the Greek, okay? Y'all. Don't y'all know that you are God's temple? That together within community, collectively, in the plurality, is a singularity, which is the temple. Paul is telling his Corinthian audience, oh, we have a temple. We have a temple. But it is one that is built by the Spirit. And it's you. And it's within me. It's within our community. Which is why you can sit in private housing and be a dwelling place in a temple of God. What we do is we find unity in community. We are bound together by the Spirit as God's sacred dwelling place. That is what's happening right here, right now in this room. Now, how many of us will walk into this room and sit down and go, sacred? Probably not very many of us. I know I did. I didn't walk in here going, this is sacred. But this is exactly what the New Testament, this is exactly what Paul is trying to teach his Corinthian people, is that within community, when the people of God gather together, this is a sacred place. That there is a sacred thing happening here within the hearts and minds of believers and with God. So let's look at God's temple as a community today. Let's look at what it means for God's temple as a community today. There are a couple of things I really want us to learn if we are to take what Jesus taught and what Paul taught seriously. I think the first thing is that the temple community belongs to God. Right, this is kind of what Paul's main point to the Corinthians is that the temple community belongs to God. It's sacred. It's holy. When a group of Jesus followers decides to gather together, whether that be on a Sunday morning, whether that be at a table with 3 or 4 of us, the Bible seems to indicate that there's something very sacred and holy about those moments. And he wants us to understand that this is not something that belongs to us. It belongs to him. It belongs to God. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a Sunday morning or we're sitting around a table. What is happening is God's, not just our own. Like in Corinthians 6, where Paul teaches that our individual bodies are not our own, but have been bought with a price. You can go to 1 Corinthians 6:20 to read more about that. Therefore, we should live accordingly. Our communities have been bought with a price. So we need to live like our communities don't belong to us, but belong to God. Now, I have no problem, don't hear what I'm not saying, okay? I have no problem with people being like, my community, right? That's good. My little girl, who's 3 years old, loves reminding me that this is her church. Okay, Daddy, this is my church. And I have not yet said, no, daughter, this is God's church. I haven't gotten that far yet. But I have no problem. I think it's good. I think it's good when we have ownership and people are going, yes, this is my community. I think that's good. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have that posture. But what I'm saying is that this truly is God's temple. This is his house. This is his place. This is his dwelling place here among us and in us. Paul gives that stark warning that I know when I read it probably made everyone feel extremely uncomfortable. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. How many of you were super comfortable around that? To this day, I've been walking with the Lord for a long time. Every time I read that, I go, right? It's an uncomfortable line. That if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. And what he means by this, in the Corinthian context, you have to kind of go back and look at the first 4 chapters of this book. But what he's talking about is a lot of the community breakage that's happening within this particular church. We have a lot of jealousy. We have a lot of division. We have a lot of infighting happening within the Corinthian church. A lot of it's based around personalities. So within the Greek system is not so different than us. We love our teachers, don't we? We love when people have the best speakers or they have the most wisdom to share, and we tend to rally around those particular individuals. No different than the Corinthian church. Because they're going around saying, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Peter, or they call him Cephas. And it's kind of building up this relational breakage in the temple, jealousy, division, and infighting. It's which Paul is now writing this letter to. So when he's talking about that, it's talking about this idea of building up somebody and building up someone who you think is just so incredibly wise to the place where it seems like the community belongs to that particular individual. And these are great New Testament leaders, right? Paul, Peter, Apollos, these are really good leaders. Really influential people in the early church, but the church doesn't belong to them, and that's what Paul's trying to communicate. He's like, the church doesn't belong to me. He calls them servants within the temple. These are servants within the temple, not the owners of the temple. The Corinthians thought they were being wise and thinking, well, we just build up the best and wisest teachers. The best teachers coming out of Corinth, baby, yeah. And Paul's like, no, these are the douloses. These are like the slaves that work in the temple, is what he's calling himself. These are the servants of the temple. And in reality, you're acting like fools, is exactly what Paul is telling the Corinthians. What Paul is warning about us today, which something we all see today, is celebrity culture and consumeristic Christianity. Can you believe that? 2,000 years ago, they're still doing the same things that we deal with today anytime we can establish community. So let's talk about the kind of what the dangers of these things can be, because they do. They do inflict damage on a temple that belongs to God. The dangers of celebrity culture are probably not super unknown by you, but I'll go through some of the 3 main things here. Some of the dangers of celebrity culture is unaccountable leadership, people who will power over community without checks and balances, leaders who prioritize personal glory over things like community care, eroding the health of that particular community. Maybe they prioritize performance and numbers over Christoformity. When we stop looking at how people are being changed into people who look like Jesus, and it's more about numbers, more about performance, we tend to cause a lot of division and strife within the community of God. When we are prioritizing personal glory over what it means to take care of community, we are going to cause a lot of division and hurt within the community, the temple of God. If we have unaccountable leaders who wield power over a community, that is no way of Jesus. And it's going to cause additional pain and brokenness within a community. And these are the things that Paul is warning them about. Do not destroy the sanctity of God's dwelling place in this way. It's interesting. I've often heard, you'll hear 1 Corinthians 3, 16 through 17 used. I've seen it used by cult leaders before. I've seen it used by people looking at the body and going, so you get in line, right? How many of you are with me on that? You've probably seen that. Where in reality, he's talking about the leadership. And he's warning the people of the church too, is don't put people on pedestals. Know that they are servants in the temple. They're not the owners of the temple. If we focus on building one another up rather than just the particular few, the community is better served. And this is what Paul, I think, is trying to advocate here. Don't get puffed up in the wisdom of what you think you know, but focus on what it means to truly build the other person up rather than just a few blocks within the temple, and see the community better served. And I honestly think that the most relative leaders of the future, of a church that is kind of being reformed by the Spirit of God right now, the global C church, that the more relative leaders of the future are going to be the most irrelative speakers. I truly think that. I don't think that the platform is going to be where we're going to find our greatest servants. Are there servants up there? Sure. But I think the future of the church really relies on those who are going unseen, and those are the most relative people. I think God wants to highlight spiritual communities, not spiritual hype men, right? I think when people look at what a community is and they are together, that is the draw. Not the branding, not the face, not the speakers, not the ones on platform, but the community. And this has been a huge blessing in my life. Because when I was a prodigal, kind of working my way back to God, realizing the error of my life and the pigsty that I had made it, and I was coming in, it wasn't a particular person that just said all the right things and was like, oh, wow, they just completely changed my life. No, it was a community of people who all functioned in a way that helped to build me up, equip me, remind me, correct me, challenge me. It took a community of people. It took a temple of the dwelling place of the Spirit to bring me home. And that's what I crave, don't you? That's what I crave, is that as a people, as a community, we live together functioning as a building, holding and building each other up as I think it was always meant to be. Now, there's the dangers of consumeristic Christianity. Some of the dangers of consumeristic Christianity, I think one is a shallow spiritual depth. When our faith becomes just a pursuit of feel-good experiences rather than transformational discipleship. Because again, you're going to be able to have a lot of good experiences here. I hope you do. I'm not saying I hope you're just miserable all the time here. Please don't hear what I'm not saying, okay? Or that if you have a good experience, you're like, oh, no, that's not it. I'm just saying when our faith becomes the pursuit of feel-good experiences, when we're looking for this kind of endorphin hit every single time, we tend to not dig our wells very deep. When we're looking for transformational discipleship, it's walking with the Lord within community every season, both the highs and the lows and the difficult and the ugly, and those are the things that truly build and equip a deep well. If we have a shallow spiritual depth, it often leads to kind of this idea of burnout when life disappoints us. We have a hard time enduring hardship as a community. And the data shows this. There was a 70% drop off from church when COVID happened. I'm not saying just people weren't coming to church. I mean, they're just like, I'm abandoning all community. 70% when this happened. Church becomes a marketplace as well. Communities can be like silver lures is what I call them. You always have these like silver lures where you have maybe a fancy speaker comes in, or maybe you have a very charismatic person or a brand new church that lands in, and there's this kind of silver lure in the water. Use a fishing analogy. When everyone's just kind of drawn to it, like, ooh, this is new and shiny, right? It creates this like church as a marketplace. You know, Barna did a study again, kind of the mean church researchers, and they said that 1 in 3 Christians switch church every year. 1 in 3. Results again in, I think, a weak, fragmented relationships. We have weak support networks. We contribute to things like isolation and lack of authentic, deep friendship. Again, 1 in 5 Christians report they have no close friends. 1 in 5. 1 in 5 of us in this room are probably thinking, I don't know who my closest friends are. And these are things that I think grieve God's heart. That it kind of goes against the face of everything he talks about with the idea of what it means to create a community that is the temple, the sacred place of the indwelling of the Spirit. That he wants to capture each and every single one of our hearts, bring us into community so we can be transformed and challenged and encouraged and built up and equipped. He doesn't want us to treat his temple as a marketplace. He doesn't want us to treat this temple as a place for just this kind of emotional high every once in a while when I need it. That it's truly a place that's meant to be a transformative place, a place where you are to meet the living God within community. Just like a building or a temple, if one block decides to check out, one block decides, I'm sick of holding up this pillar, the whole building feels the consequences. And this is so important. That half the battle in being in community is just showing up within community. Like, I think a lot of us, we come into church and we go, well, I'm not important. I don't do anything, but I don't think you understand just how encouraging it is for somebody, especially someone like me, when they just sees your face. Like when you just show up sometimes, it's the most encouraging thing. When you're just present is a big part of the battle. I hope we can all come to a community where you can get what you need. I do. But you're also keeping your eyes open for what other people need too. A community that's on that kind of swivel head of going, okay, like, how can I love somebody right now? How can I encourage somebody right now? How can I pray for somebody right now? You just don't know the stories that walk into this building, do you? Many of you who are in here probably are just going, I just want somebody to say hi to me. I just want to not feel so alone at this moment. And they've walked into the very dwelling place of God. When communities exist to serve one another, rather than our own desires, our own motivations or needs, we resist the idea of destroying the temple. Treat the body, treat the community as a sacred place with deep respect and admiration. Not because I said so, but because it is the indwelling of the Spirit here on earth. That heaven and earth are coming together in this kind of meeting place. Now within the church, now within the community of God. Think about that next time you have coffee with a believer. Next time you sit down with somebody and you ask them how they're doing, think about this is a sacred responsibility. This is a holy responsibility that I get to then sit with this person. And it's a community that experiences God together. And this is how I'll end this. A community that experiences God together. That we are a community empowered and indwelled by the Holy Spirit, and that's a core identity of who we are. Enjoy that. Enjoy that. Don't just come and go on a Sunday, but I want to challenge you to really get to know the people in this community. Dive into their lives. Build deeper relationships for the time that we have together, because we're not here for very long, are we? The older I get, the more this is becoming a reality to me. We just are not here very long to fight, to always be divisive, to always be angry with one another. Our time is too short. Spend that time, that real intentional time of getting to know and to love and to be with one another. God has done his best work, not alone, not when I'm alone, but when I'm sitting with people at tables. When I'm sitting at people at tables. Because one of the cool byproducts of living within the temple of the Holy Spirit in the community is that it gives us kind of a spiritual discernment that communities offer to us. One of Amy and I's practices that we do basically since we've been married is we don't make big decisions without incorporating community. We always incorporate community. In fact, every decision we make here at this church is not by me unilaterally. It is all done within a community of people. We asked numerous people to pray with us, to talk with us. I can't tell you how many conversations we had about, are people sensing the same spiritual direction as we are when we came to Pullman? There were a lot of people in Utah who we were talking to and going, is this where you feel like the Lord is leading us? And they could have really sabotaged us, right? Thankfully, they didn't. Put people around you who you can ask questions about. Say, hey, I'm thinking about making this big move at work, or I'm thinking about, moving to a different place, or whatever it is, whatever that big decision is, bring community in. Don't just do it on a one-on-one basis, even just with you and your spouse. That's an important place to start, but broaden it out. Find your community. Help them to speak that spiritual discernment into your life as well. A function of spiritual community is that we be a place of spiritual discernment. Ask people to listen to what you're worried about, what you're thinking about long term. Don't just fly solo pretending like you know what's best. This is one of the great byproducts of being within the dwelling place of God, is that it gives us a place of spiritual discernment to ask questions, to learn, to go, here's what I'm thinking, what do you think? And have that place. I think that's a really important part of this community. So let's be a people who take Paul's word seriously, that we ourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in our midst. That our temple here is sacred, and that we together are that temple.